We're going to have Jay Tomkus from Mesa, and he comes highly recommended. He's an environmental attorney, and Jay said that I could call him a water lawyer. We'd like to introduce you, and you can start telling us about water issues in Arizona.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. Water is a super important issue these days. I figured I'd start with just a brief introduction of who I am. Despite my appearance, I'm not in fact 12 years old, but I've been working in politics and water for the last 11 years or so, mainly here in Arizona, but also up in Washington State. Rosanna Gabaldon recommended me to this group largely because I used to work for her. I was the staff attorney for natural resources issues at the Arizona State House for the Democratic Caucus. And she was the ranking member on the Natural Resources Committee. So we worked quite a bit together, and she has always been such a great leader on water issues. So it was my pleasure to work with her, and she's wonderful. I know many of you probably know her personally, so she's great. I also, at the same time, Kirsten Engel was in the House of Representatives as well, and she's also just become such an expert on water issues and running for Congress, I heard, and you can pick up her signs, but she's wonderful. I can't recommend her enough. She, in fact, just wrote an op-ed in the Tucson paper about Colorado River issues that we'll talk about a little bit. I left the state legislature about 5 years ago, and then worked as a water attorney in a boutique firm that does water law and federal Indian law. So oftentimes on water issues, I take it from the tribal perspective, which you'll hear a little bit about in the presentation. And in addition to that, I also set up a lobbying firm. So I work at the state capitol quite a bit, work on water issues with policymakers on that, as well as other issues. So I've been in and around the water conversations in the state for about a decade, and happy to share just a brief introduction of water. Of course, it gets pretty complicated pretty quick. So my thought for today was to just give you sort of a framework on water, and then talk about some of the critical issues that I'm sure you're reading about in the papers or hearing about. I'm not in love with the sound of my own voice, so feel free to jump in with questions if it's practical to do so. I'll try to keep an eye out for hands raised. I think that's probably the best way. But for now, I will share my screen. So here's sort of the presentation overview. When we talk about water in Arizona, it's a little complicated, not because water is necessarily different or the chemical properties of water, but because we treat different types of water differently in the state. And they're largely legal, sort of imaginary distinctions between them, but because we treat them differently in law, it's worthwhile sort of stepping through just quickly what they are, how they're treated, and what it means for you. So I'll talk about those differences a little bit, and then we'll just jump into surface water rights, which you may have heard about, especially in southern Arizona in the San Pedro Basin, where there's active adjudication of water rights. And of course, there's the added complication of federal water rights for the San Pedro riparian natural area. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Colorado River and Central Arizona Project water. Everyone's heard a lot about Lake Mead in the last few months, and it's a pretty dire situation there. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And groundwater management is it's all connected to each other, but we treat groundwater differently in the state, and because of that, we'll have to sort of explain that. But there's also news on that if you've been following the Wilcox area and their effort to establish an active management area. So talk about all that stuff. And then, I'm shooting for hopefully about a 25-minute presentation, and then should be plenty of time for questions, and always happy to take questions. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Also, excuse the water puns, they are unavoidable. But first, so let's talk about the legal classifications of water in the state of Arizona. And like I said, these are generally speaking legal fictions. The The quality of water always differs by the source. That's not why these regulations are in place. But first, surface water. When I say surface water, I mean water that comes from a sort of naturally occurring channel for water. So that could be through rain, through springs, seeps, snow melts, all of those things. Once they're in a naturally occurring channel, so a river or a wash or a stream, they get treated as surface water in the state. The next bucket is Colorado River water, which factually is surface water that comes from all those sources, but comes from the Colorado River, which is a basin that includes 7 states, and most of the water that comes from it comes from snow melt in the upper basin in the Rockies. So that's treated differently in law because of those interstate and federal contracts. And then groundwater is the water that's underground in what are called aquifers. And aquifers, they're not, sometimes people put pictures and it looks like there's a big lake underground. There's not a lake. This is the water that's in between rocks and sand and all of those bits that make up the ground underneath us. All those spaces in between them fill up with water. And Arizona, because of the geography of it and the history of it, generally has very deep and very large aquifers that store a lot of water. And that means there's a lot of water resources in there. It also means that that's our, that the risks associated with it are just as important. So I'll also make a note, and I'll talk about it a little bit more later, but science tells us that groundwater and surface water are connected. That the water that goes to the aquifer will make its way to a surface water stream and flow because groundwater flows. And because of that, it's a little tricky when you think about the distinction between the two, but it is in fact a legal fiction that the Arizona Supreme Court declared. Most states in the West have gotten rid of the distinction between surface water and groundwater, and that is rational. But in Arizona, we're holding on to this legal fiction, and there's no likelihood that it's going to change. We just sort of have to deal with the legal implications of that. So I'll jump in first with surface water. Arizona uses, and I'm sure, this is Arizona, so I'm sure many of you come from different parts of the United States. Maybe you retired here, maybe you moved here a few decades ago, but Arizona treats water legally in a structure that's called Western Water Law. It's also called the Law of Prior Appropriation. And essentially, Western Water Law was established really during the California Gold Rush, when miners would lay claims to different areas, and they needed water to process their ore. They would they'd mine out ore, they'd put it on what's called a sluice, which if you've ever been with your kids or grandkids to like a mining museum and you pan for gold, it'll be across a sluice. Essentially, it's a big mesh wire. You put the ore on top of it and then you run water across it. That cleans out the dust, the dirt, and leaves the minerals behind, essentially. That process takes a lot of water. So the miners would stake a claim to water and say, miner X on this date claims 5 miners inches of water, and that would be their priority date. They would literally stake their claim to that water at the source. And that's really the foundation of Western water law. But when you think about it, people go on and on about how complicated it is, and there's a lot of legal complication associated with it. But really, what it is sort of the same rules that my kids have in the back seat when they're fighting over a toy. I had it first is generally the rule. So here's an example of that. So let's say someone moves in, and in 1910 starts diverting water and putting it to a use. Maybe they're mining, or maybe they're growing crops, right? If they're there first, we call them the senior user. And then someone comes and moves in 50 years ago, 60 years ago, and they use it for some other purpose. We call them the junior user because they were there last. It doesn't matter that the junior user in this case is upstream. under Western water law, the senior user is entitled to take his full right, his or her full right, before the junior user is allowed to take anything. Now, when there's two people, it's sort of easy to understand. When there are thousands of people on the same river system, it gets very complicated very quickly. But that's sort of the rule, right? I had it first. If I'm here first, I get all of my water before anyone else gets theirs. The next person down the line gets all of theirs before anyone junior to them. And that's how it goes. That's Western water law. And that's generally speaking, the way states regulate water in the Western United States. It's very different on the East Coast, which is actually where I went to law school, where they do something called riparian law. And all of that law is generally around how do you get rid of water because they have too much. And that comes from the English common law. I'll also note, and this is relevant to Southern Arizona as well as to Indian tribes that I represent on water issues, but water rights from just sort of a citizen of the state of Arizona or the territory of Arizona back then, those are based on state law or territorial law at the time. And because of that, there are also rights that are based on federal law, and these are rights that are held by Indian tribes or water rights that are associated with federal reservations of some kind. Like I mentioned, the San Pedro Riparian National Conservation Area, as well as Fort Huachuca, military bases in the state. These rights, essentially what the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court has said for 100 years, is that when Congress sets aside some land for some purpose, it impliedly sets aside enough water to carry out that purpose. So for Indian reservations, that's enough water to create a permanent tribal homeland for that tribe. And that can mean a lot of different things. It could mean, establishing an agricultural economy. It could mean providing for other economic drivers. But it's enough water to have sort of a reliable homeland for that tribe into the future forever, right? In the case of the San Pedro Riparian National Conservation Area, SPRNCA, that is, in fact, the purpose was to conserve the riparian area. So it's entitled to enough water to conserve that. That's currently being litigated, and I'll talk about that in a second. But generally speaking, because these are water rights from whether they're state-based or federally based, and they all come from the same source, the same molecules of water, there's generally a lot of conflict between them. So because of that, Congress in its wisdom, that was a bit of sarcasm. The Congress in its wisdom said, okay, we're going to allow the states to adjudicate water rights where there's a conflict between state and federal based water rights. And that has led to two massive adjudications, legal processes in the state that cover just about every surface water in the state. And so if you look here in the yellow, the faint yellow color, I don't know if you can see my cursor. This is the Gila River adjudication, and that is all of the river and basin systems that flow into the Gila River. So you have the upper Gila, Salt, Verde, Agua Fria, San Pedro, and the river that flows through Tucson is, my mind blanked at the moment, I apologize. And they all flow into the Gila River. So all of those are subject to one adjudication. That began in 1974, 10 years before I was born, almost, wow, 40 years into it. And there's no end in sight. It'll take at least another 40 years. There's 25,000 individual claimants, 90,000 individual claims. It's a mess. The Little Colorado is a little smaller, started a little bit later, and that has about 5,000 claimants and 15,000 claims. So when we talk about surface water, it's sort of all stuck in court right now. And you may have some neighbors in the San Pedro area who are starting to get summons from claims that maybe their predecessor to the land filed back in the 80s. They should go to court on those, but they need to they need to protect their claims to water by going through this adjudication process. And it's slowly moving, but it is moving, and in particular down in the San Pedro right now. So that's all I'll talk about with surface water. It's sort of a mess because of the legal process, but of course, our surface rivers and streams are suffering from climate change the same way the Colorado River is, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But I just wanted to give you the sense of, especially when people talk about adjudication of water rights and surface water rights, this is what they're talking about. So we'll turn the page from that. Happy to answer any questions. Actually, I represent two tribes in the adjudication, the Pascua Yaqui tribe down near Tucson, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and the Yavapai Apache Nation, which is on the Verde River. So, happy to talk about those as well. But let's turn the page to the Colorado River. Of course, you all know the Colorado River is the western border of Arizona. And it is, like I said, the drainage of a basin that includes 7 states. So, the upper basin, you have Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, New Mexico. Lower basin, generally, you have Arizona, Nevada, and California. And this is essentially a river system that feeds the West. It's maybe the most used river in the world, and we're all reliant on it. Regulation of the river actually came relatively early in as these things go. The rules for deciding who gets water when are based on what is generally called the law of the river, which sounds very mysterious, but it's a collection of different compacts, congressional acts, agreements, contracts between all of the different users of the river and entitlement holders. You can actually, the Bureau of Reclamation manages the river. That's an organization underneath the Secretary of Interior. The Secretary is actually the water master of the river, but Reclamation manages it. And you can actually go to Reclamation's website and order the law of the river. It's like this green bound book that's about like that big. It's huge. Really great reading, obviously, but you can also find it online. But just real quick, sort of the most important documents for Arizona in particular, you have the Colorado River Compact, which was a compact is a constitutional process for creating federal law where at least 2 states, in this case 7 states, get together, they make an agreement, a mutual agreement together, and if it's accepted by Congress, it has the power of federal law. So that's one way to create laws under our constitutional system, which is pretty interesting to me because I'm a big nerd. So the 7 basin states got together in 1922. They passed the Colorado River Compact, and essentially what they did is they said, all right, we're going to split the river into upper basin and lower basin at Lee's Ferry, which, if you've driven up to the Navajo Nation or to Page, you pass Lee's Ferry. And they said, well, no one's using all of the water right now anyway. That's about the halfway point. So let's just say the lower basin below Lee's Ferry gets 7.5 million acre feet. The upper basin above Lee's Ferry gets 7.5 million acre feet. Happy, it's all good. We're fine. And we'll move on with that. And, historically that doesn't, or, geographically, it doesn't make a lot of sense because most people farm, and the best farmland is closer to the delta of any river. So it'd be, Yuma irrigation, Imperial irrigation, all those areas are really where the great farmland is. And you have the upper basin where the water comes from, but is, mostly just used for pasture, not great for commercial crops, generally speaking. So it didn't make a lot of sense back then. They estimated there's about 15 million acre feet in the river, which it was a particularly wet time. You can see some pictures of Yuma during that time where they're wiped out by floods. But it was historically, and you can look back in the tree rings to find out, historically a very wet time for the Colorado River. So if you average that out over time, there was never that much water in the river for 15 million acre feet, but here we are. Then the United States added a minute to the treaty, the border treaty between Mexico and the United States, and promised another 1.5 million acre feet of water to Mexico to be delivered through the Colorado River. I should pause. An acre foot, sorry, is for those. I throw it out there as it's generally sort of the standard of measurement in the United States for water. Internationally, they use cubic meters, which is rational, and we all know what that is. But an acre foot is an acre of land. So think a football field filled 1 foot deep with water. And in more practical terms, that's about enough water for 2 to 3 homes in the state of Arizona for a year. So we're talking, 15 million acre feet is quite a bit of water. So now if you add up what the Colorado River Compact promised out, 15 million acre feet plus another 1.5 million acre feet, that's 16.5 million acre feet. By comparison, the river is producing now in this 22nd year of drought in the West, and really acidification in the West. We're talking about probably more on the order of 10 to 12 million acre feet a year. So we have a huge over allocation problem, which we'll talk about in a bit. So next came the Boulder Canyon Project Act, which was an act of Congress that divided the lower Colorado River Basin allocation. So California got 4.4 million acre feet, Arizona got 2.8 million acre feet. Las Vegas didn't really exist at the time, so they got 3.3 million acre feet, 300,000 acre feet. And now they're a leader really in water conservation in the lower basin. And then the Arizona v. California decision was a really important decision that was a Supreme Court decision, and it broke down water rights for tribes on the Colorado River, but it also made the really important distinction that surface water that we talked about in the previous slide that comes from the Gila River or the Little Colorado River, that doesn't count towards the Colorado River allocation. So that water is treated exclusively by state law. Colorado River, we have an entitlement 2.8 million acre feet. And of course, if you've been to the Colorado River to Yuma or Quartzsite or Parker or anywhere along there, you'll realize we definitely don't have the population or the uses for 2.8 million acre feet along the river, and we definitely didn't 100 years ago, right? So for the next 50 years or so, the goal really was to find a way to deliver that Colorado River water into the state of Arizona where the population is, right? So you're looking into the Phoenix metro area, the Tucson metro area, points south. And so they planned in 1968 and appropriated the money for the Central Arizona Project, which is a canal that takes water, lifts it 1,000 feet over the course of it and moves it about 300 miles across the state. And so that water that comes from the CAP, sometimes you'll hear about CAP water, that's Colorado River water that's being delivered. That water is the most junior user of water on the Colorado River. And if you talk with people who work there, they use the term sponge contract, which is not really a thing, but generally they take all the water that's not used on river. They're junior to all the uses on the river, as we talked about before on surface water, same term there. But they essentially don't leave anything over. And that's especially true now. So within that CA, so we have priority on the river, on the Colorado River, and that's subject to the law of the river. And then you also have priority within the CAP system, which is, of course, that junior user that takes all the water. This is, we sort of call it the block chart in water, but if you think about priority, who gets water first? Lower on the block is better, right? Because if you think about it like a glass, right? As you fill up the water, you get to the top, but what's left is always at the bottom. So P3, don't worry about that. That's a little bit of Auchin's Indian community settlement. Then you have Indian water rights, which there are tribes throughout the state, not the on-river tribes, that have CAP allocations, including Pasquayaki. They have 500 acre feet. TO has water, Gila River Indian community. And then you have MNI, which is municipal and industrial uses. That's cities, mainly cities. And private water companies have a little bit. NIA, you really don't have to worry about that word means. It means technically it's non-Indian agriculture, but in fact, most of those rights are held by tribes at this point because of a lot of politics. Don't worry about it. And then the ag pool, which is essentially all these folks who had NIA water before traded for a lower priority and a big pile of money from the federal government to get this pool of water. You know, this when I started in water in the state of Arizona, you know, 7 or 8 years ago, the question was always, well, what goes in the ag pool and what's this other excess and what can we do with that other excess? Well, things have changed considerably because this is what we're looking at in 2023 due to shortages on the Colorado River. So don't worry about tier 1. This is where we were in 2022. Tier 1 shortage. So all this grayed out area, that's priority that we don't have the water to fill. So these folks don't get anything, right? No ag pool water. About 3/4 of the NIA water was unavailable, and definitely no uses for other excess water, which I could talk about, but doesn't matter at this point. Next year, we're going into tier 2A, and I could show you the big chart, but essentially it's the next level of shortage. And that means all of the NIA water is gone and a bit of the Indian and MNI priority water. We really don't know how much until water orders come in October, but generally speaking, there's going to be a small haircut for tribes and for cities, and anyone who has a contract for NIA water is not getting that water next year. So that's Colorado River water, real quick, and this is all real quick and dirty because I don't want to keep you here for the whole weekend. But we'll talk briefly about groundwater, and then I'll introduce a couple of the issues you may have heard about, and then really looking forward to questions from this group. So groundwater, as I said, there's a distinction between surface water and groundwater that is a legal fiction. If you look at this is the San Pedro River, and this is the area within the river that is considered the subflow zone. Within that, groundwater is treated as though it's surface water for law purposes, but you don't have to worry too much about that. The most important thing to know with groundwater in the state is that the state of Arizona regulates very little of it, and really only in what are called active management areas, which there's 4, the Prescott AMA, Phoenix, Pinal, Tucson AMA, and Santa Cruz is an AMA, that's right. And then there's irrigation non-expansion areas, and irrigation non-expansion areas just means when it's established, no one can irrigate new land. Active management areas actually put out regulations for the use of water by users in those areas. We can get into it, but it's very difficult, if not impossible, to create new active management areas or irrigation non-expansion areas under the statute. And these were all established in 1980, Groundwater Management Act. And the story goes that Governor Bruce Babbitt at the time called the Interior Secretary. Remember I told you 1968 was when Congress authorized the creation of the CAP? Well, they didn't allow the funds for it. The feds didn't allow the funds for it during that time because essentially they said, state of Arizona, we're not going to build you this incredibly expensive infrastructure to take that Colorado River water until you figure out how to manage groundwater. We're not going to continue to pour water into a leaky bucket. So get your act together on groundwater, then we'll bring the CAP. The story is that Bruce Babbitt at the time called the Secretary of Interior and said, I need you to make a threat that you will take the CAP project off of the list of authorized infrastructure programs unless we get it done like in the next year. And Secretary of Interior made that threat, and as a result, it forced everyone into the room in the state to create the 1980 Groundwater Management Act, which essentially said in these areas where the population is, we're going to regulate groundwater in these ways. Anywhere else that's not in a colored blob here, there is no regulation of groundwater. You can pump all you want. And that's causing a real problem in the state. And really the fundamental problem the fundamental problem is if there's no regulation for groundwater, you don't have a right to groundwater, right? So you can own land, you can sink a well, you can take water from that aquifer that we talked about, and then someone can move next to you. Maybe they grow alfalfa for horses in Saudi Arabia. Maybe it's Monsanto growing tomatoes, right? Could be any corporate farmer that comes to the state, realizes we have these great aquifers and no regulation of them, and they'll come in, sink a deeper well, take tons of water, industrial production size wells, and will quickly drop the water level in those aquifers below where your well takes water. And so Wilcox in particular has been featured in the New York Times, and the Washington Post, LA Times, the Guardian, the Inquirer, all of those international publications, really, because that is literally happening right now in the Wilcox Basin. And that is a closed basin. There's no natural recharge to it. The only water that's there is, we call it fossil groundwater, water that's been there forever. And because of that, folks who move there, maybe to retire, to get away, live the rural lifestyle, even wine grape growers who move there, because it's actually a great place to grow wine grapes, they're moving in, having these deep wells drilled, and then industrial agriculture is coming in next door, pumping the aquifer down below it, and then the sinks in these houses, you turn them on and nothing comes out, or dust comes out, or mud comes out, because the well is dry. And that's a real challenge, and a real reason why in Wilcox there was such a movement to collect signatures to authorize a new active management area for the Wilcox Basin. And that's never been done before. Statute allows it, but it's actually never happened before. So it's really interesting experiment in water management to see what happens if that passes in November. So I'm watching that really closely. So that's sort of surface water, groundwater, Colorado River water. Think of those as like the three buckets of water in the state, the three types of water that we can talk about and people fight over and often do. But they are all challenged. And the number one challenge that threatens all three of those sources of water is climate change. Of course, we are living through the reality of climate change now. It is causing what folks used to call a drought that's lasted for 22 years in the state of Arizona. In fact, now I think it's appropriate to call it aridification. The Colorado River Basin is getting drier, and that's the effects of climate change. This is a chart from a map from the EPA. The change in climate in 120 years, 1901 to 2021, you'll see the West generally has gotten a lot higher, and in particular Arizona, right? And what that means, what higher temperatures mean, ambient temperatures increasing by 4.5 degrees in spots, even 2.5, 3 degrees, that dries out everything. That removes moisture from the soil, for instance, and makes it more difficult for surface water systems, including the Colorado River, to behave as they have historically, right? We know climate change brings unpredictable weather patterns. It also creates a lot of changes in the way that weather, including moisture and hydrology, interacts with the geography and geology of the basin. And that's creating a lot of challenges. And we're seeing that on the Colorado River system. And so what reclamation is saying is actually that the increased temperatures over the year are drying out the soil in a way that they hadn't before. And so, for example, last year, the Colorado River Basin got an average year, 100% of average of precipitation, snowfall. Most of the water that comes into rivers and streams comes from snowfall, especially true in the Colorado River. But even though we had a pretty good precipitation year, a lot of snow up in the mountains, it only resulted in 60% of the average inflow to the river. And so you have a normal year for water, but only about 2/3 of it is actually making it into the river. And what they're learning is that the reason it's not making it into the river is because the soil is drier. And so that soil is absorbing water to get healthy again. But when it absorbs that water, that's water that's not flowing over the top into the river systems and flowing into the reservoirs. And that climate change driven reduction in runoff is, in addition to the overallocation that we've been dealing with for a long time on the Colorado River, is really causing the crisis that we're in today. So this is a chart. It's from the Bureau of Reclamation, and it's a little hard. So I'll take a minute to explain it. The two largest reservoirs on the Colorado River system, I'm sure you know about them. You have Lake Mead, which is behind Hoover Dam, and Lake Powell, which is behind Glen Canyon Dam, on the border of Utah and Arizona. And those were designed to operate together and to provide storage for operations on the Colorado River to make sure that there's enough water to deliver those under those contracts under the law of the river. So if you look in the blue here, that's Lake Mead storage over time. Over here, you have how many million acre feet are in storage. Remember what an acre foot is. And then in the gray, which is stacked on top of this blue number, that's the amount of water in Lake Powell, storage in Lake Powell. So if you add those together, you get this line. And if you look at 1999, which is the year before the drought started, we had 47.6 million acre feet of water. That's 92% of the total capacity. My mom lived in Las Vegas in 2000. I remember driving up to visit her. And that was before the bypass, obviously. So I was driving on Hoover Dam past the intake towers for Lake Mead, and it was completely full. And I have this distinct memory of it being like, wow, there's not a lot of space. And the managers, the Bureau of Reclamation, were starting to be concerned about managing the dam in what's called flood control, where there's not enough space to store it. And so how do you release it without causing health risks to people's health and safety? And then 2000 happened, a couple good years in there of rain, but really complete downward trend. Here we are in 2022, 12.8 million acre feet, 25% of capacity. So in the span of 22 years, we've gone from pretty much full to a quarter of total capacity, largely driven by climate change, which has made for very dry and unpredictable weather, but also because of that overallocation of the river system. And because, frankly, a lot of water managers being reckless in decision making. And that's really problematic. So here we are, 2022, we have to figure out how to deal with that. Kirsten Engel wrote a really great op-ed in the Tucson paper. Take a look at that. The big problem is we need leadership from the Bureau of Reclamation, the Secretary of Interior, to figure out how to use between 2 and 4 million acre feet less in a year. That would be on top of the 540,000 acre feet that Arizona is already taking in shortage. So it's a real problem. It's a big problem, and you're going to be hearing a lot more about it in the coming months. That is something definitely to watch. It's very concerning. The risk of the Colorado River system, of Lake Mead and Lake Powell crashing to the point of what we call dead pool, where there's not an ability to get water past the dam. Those are real risks in the next couple of years. So it's very concerning. Pay attention to it. There's not a happy story there. It's really kind of depressing. The other challenge, and of course, because Arizona, about 40% of the water that comes into the state or is used in the state is Colorado River water. And the idea, going back to that call between the Governor Babbitt and the Secretary of Interior, was we're going to conserve groundwater. We're going to use renewable sources from the Colorado River as much as we can to conserve that fossil groundwater, because if it recharges very slowly. We've done an okay job in those active management areas, pretty terrible job other places. But as there's less Colorado River water coming in, there will be more groundwater usage, and that creates real risks as well. If you look, so these are two pictures. The one on the right's pretty famous. That's not Arizona. That's the San Joaquin Valley in California. But if you look at this pole, this is the ground level in these different years. So here, 1977, when that was taken, I'm sure it's much lower now. That's where the ground is. In 1925, it was, what's that, about 30, 40 feet higher. And the reason for that is that when water comes out of an aquifer, remember I told you at the beginning that water sort of lives in those spaces between sand and clay and rocks, right? That's what an aquifer is. When that water comes out, when it's pumped out, all of that space gets compressed in, pushes in. And so the weight of the earth starts pushing it down. And that creates what's called land subsidence, where the land literally goes down. And that itself creates a lot of very practical problems. And if you look on the left, this is a fissure, the land literally cracking apart. And that's in Cochise County. I think it was a couple of years ago. But you can see, especially if you drive in the Wilcox Basin, but it's also true out in Mojave County, it's true throughout the state of Arizona, where there is over-reliance on groundwater, the land starts to subside. You sort of don't notice it when you're standing on it, right? But those fissures start creating where there's an imbalance in the land, and that creates not just cracks in the desert, but it breaks apart highways, right? And so you have to start paying a lot more for maintenance. It breaks wells, it breaks all of those things that we sort of take for granted. And that's a function, I mean, like water is life, as the tribes say, but also it's something that we rely on for everything. And when that starts going away, it starts changing the ways we interact with infrastructure, with the world, with each other. And so it's a real concern. And of course, once, especially in Wilcox, where there's no natural recharge of the aquifer, once that water's gone, it's gone. So we really should put in place policies that allow for the preservation of that. That's true throughout the state, and there's some additional discussion of that. But mainly, especially, well, this is the Green Valley Democrats. I'm a lifelong Democrat. I worked for Democrats in Congress and at the state legislature, but the Republican approach in this state historically and especially now has always been, we'll just find a way to find water somewhere else. And they'll do that so that they can use that water. The best use of water in their idea is the use of water. No need to conserve anything. There's just not water. I mean, if we go back and look at this, there's no great place for water across the West. And if there's been articles written about a canal or a pipeline from the Missouri system or from the Mississippi system, that costs $25 billion, and to operate it would cost even more. It's not practical, but when your only concept of water management is how do I find more water, those are the only things that become possible. Conservation is going to be key, because that's sort of the low-hanging fruit. That's places where you can find water because it's being wasted somewhere. And of course, 80% of the water in the Colorado River system, and it's probably about that same number for groundwater. In the state of Arizona, about 80% of the water is used for outdoor irrigation of some kind. In the Colorado River system, those 7 states, it's used, 80% of the water is used for agriculture. And about 80% of that water is used for forage crops like alfalfa. So, we're getting to a point, because the water's not there, that we have to start looking at those uses and make policy decisions about what the best way to use that water is. So those are sort of the challenges we're facing. There's a lot of them. I could spend a lot of time, but because this is a presentation about water in Arizona, here's your obligatory picture of, Horseshoe Bend in the Grand Canyon. Let's hope there's water still in it in a couple of years. But that's my presentation. I'm happy to take questions. I hope I didn't depress you too much.
If you have a question, please raise your hand. Sue Rowan has a question.
I live in Quail Creek, and when we bought here and we were talking to the people about water in this area. They said, oh, we have our own wells and we guarantee water for 100 years. Well, I'm beginning to wonder about that. Are we outside the area where it's controlled, or what's the story there? That seems really strange.
Yeah, it's you're in a really complicated space, but let me try to explain it. It's so you're in the Santa Cruz active management area. Active management area is one of the primary tools for conserving water in an active management area. Is a requirement for new homes, before they can be built or platted. They have to have what's called a certificate of assured water supply. And like you said, that's a promise that there will be 100 years worth of water that is legally and physically available. But like you said, you get it from a well, right? So how do those two things work together? Well, essentially, the way that developers sort of shape the law to plat these places out without having to go find surface water for a long time is they created something that's called the Central Arizona Groundwater Replenishment District. And they take tax money from members to CAGRD, as we call it. They take that tax money and the cost, and bill by the water that you take as well. And then they essentially say, you have a promise for that 100-year water supply. CAGRD is going to go find that water and replenish the water that you use. So you're taking the water out from your well, and CAGRD, which is run by the same board that runs the CAP, they have to go find water somewhere to put back in the ground after you take it out. So it gets pretty complicated, but that's how that works for you.
Jay, thanks for the presentation. My question is, in order to actually get a handle on this, and what I mean by that in my mind is to get the agriculture to stop what's happening. How do we do that? I mean, is this on a state level? Is it on a national level? Where is it we need to put pressure to get this stopped? Because it's insane that there is agriculture like it is in these Western states.
Sure. Yeah, and so as I was mentioning earlier, actually, my grandfather is a farmer in Costa Rica. So, and when I worked up in Washington State, I spent a lot of time on farms during outreach for a member of Congress there. The answer is like there are places historically, for instance, you know, if you look back thousands of years, Egypt and Cairo and those were all developed in a desert, but it was in the Nile Delta, right? Because that's where a lot of natural water was. It was a desert, but because there was a good quantity of water and great soil, it was incredibly fertile. That's true in the Colorado River system as well, which is why you had a lot of agricultural development in the Yuma region, right? Because a lot of that is that sediment that runs off historically. That's still, even in a time of shortage, is your most efficient place to grow crops in a lot of cases. But the question is like, what kind of crops are you going? Crop selection. So Yuma and Imperial Irrigation District together generate about 90% of the winter leafy vegetables for North America, right? That in terms of a food system, that's important, right? We want people to be eating those. That's good. We also grow a ton of forage crops for dairies. We have a lot of dairies in the state, which, you know, milk does not generate a lot of revenue. It's not a great business, and if it weren't for federal subsidies on dairy, then it wouldn't be particularly effective. So the question isn't like, should farmers farm? I think the question is, what should we be encouraging in agriculture, and should we commit resources to it? the manager of the Southern Nevada Water Authority, so the person who runs the water system for Las Vegas and Southeast Nevada, put out a letter the last few weeks saying, 80% of our water in the Colorado goes to agriculture and 80% of that goes to forage crops. You have to compare the economic viability of that versus, providing water for people in their homes. And so, I think looking at agriculture is important. You asked sort of where do you direct your attention? I think the crisis on the Colorado River is pressing, and I think pushing the Secretary of Interior and our congressional delegation and the California congressional delegation to understand that there needs to be federal action and leadership here is probably the best thing you could do right now. So, direct your letters to Secretary Holland.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Matthew, for the question. There are 4 chats, Jay, that basically are saying interesting and excellent presentation. Roseanne Gabaldon did have a comment about the river you're trying to think of that comes through here into Tucson and Santa Cruz.
Santa Cruz.
Also,
They recharge on that. Well, there's been a lot of rains there, but they also recharge water in the Santa Cruz now. That's not.
Yeah.
I just wondered how water for mining fits into all this, Jay. I'm concerned specifically about the mining proposed for the Santa Ritas and how that would affect the water supply to Green Valley and Sahuarita.
Yeah. Well, I might defer to Senator Gabaldon on that because she is really the leader on the Democratic side on water issues, in particular with mines. And so, but just a quick answer is, generally speaking, mines use groundwater, and there are already almost no restrictions on groundwater where those mines are, but they have many carve-outs in Title 45, allowing them to essentially pump the water that they need for their processes. That's very concerning, especially in Pinal County, where there's just not water physically available for mining and other uses. In the Santa Ritas, it's it's a real concern. That's really a water quality concern, I think, there, which is sort of another question altogether. But absolutely, I mean, mines use a ton of water, and dating back to to that California gold rush I mentioned, right? Processing, using it, and of course, mines had to de-water as well as they dig, right? They had to take the water out so it doesn't flood into, whether it's a pit mine or if it's a different type of mine. So, they use a lot of water. There's been some studies about how much they use, but they try to, they don't try to publicize how much water they use.
I just wondered if Jay would talk about Butler Valley and that mess of illegal activities, so to speak, with the Saudis and what's going on up there, if that will ever get resolved.
Yeah, I mean, the depressing thing is it's actually not illegal, but essentially the, Butler and Harquahala valleys, in the 1980 Groundwater Management Act, the expectation was that those groundwater basins, which are deep and contain a lot of water, would be used as essentially insurance for the Phoenix metro area in the future, that if it were needed, that water could be pumped out of those areas, put into the Central Arizona project, and served down to the Phoenix area, right? So it was sort of an insurance policy. Because there's no restriction there really, or in the case of Harquahala, where they could come in, buy up old farms and use wells, a lot of, a few firms that produce alfalfa for Saudi Arabian dairies came in, sunk those big production wells and started pouring out water. And if you think about exporting alfalfa, really you should just think about it as exported water, because that there's no crop grown in Arizona that uses more water than alfalfa, forage crop. So, but because there's no restriction, it wasn't illegal. The real sort of kicker, which came out a few months ago, is that not only are they doing that, but they're doing it on state trust land, which is land that's owned by the state of Arizona and can be leased for different purposes, but they're doing it for pretty cheap, and they're not essentially being charged for the water they're taking out. So they're growing this alfalfa for pretty much free in Arizona, draining these incredibly important valleys and aquifers, and sending it out of country with really no economic benefit to the state. I mean, everything takes water, right? And we want a diverse economy. For instance, semiconductor manufacturers coming into the state of Arizona, increasingly, that takes a lot of water, but also employs a lot of people, right? So if we're making decisions about what the best use of water is it growing alfalfa for dairy cows in Saudi Arabia, or is it using that water for jobs that people need? So it's terrible. What could we do about it? I mean, we could regulate groundwater outside of the active management areas. That's a hard conversation to have, but it might start coming. So there's increased conversation about that at the state legislature. It's going to be a challenge, but
To follow that up, how much power does the governor have to instruct the state land department to force the Butler Valley change? I mean, the figures I've read about is the Saudis should be paying about $5.42 million a year for the last 7 years. I mean, if the governor can change that and set those funds aside for schools, that could be a $38 million in the educational trust system. So
yeah, I mean, I'd have to research it from a statutory perspective, but like the short answer is, like, the governor doesn't really have, and the state land commissioner doesn't really have the authority. It might be a stretch, and there would definitely be litigation to charge essentially the going rate of water, which, if you think about Colorado River water at this point, the going rate is something like $280 an acre foot, plus the cost to deliver it, which is quite a bit. But there would probably need to be a statutory change for that.
Can you speak about the new expansion of the WIFA? This is from Rosanna Gabaldon. New legislation this past session, she said.
Yeah, apologize for not mentioning it, because that's actually a big story, and apologies to Senator Gabaldon. She was very involved in it. Do you want to go first, Senator, or do you want me to talk about it? I'm happy to defer to you.
Oh, well, Jay, thank you, everybody. And thank you, Jay, for
Thank you,
being here
Senator.
today. I appreciate it. I'm just gonna go very quickly on two things that you spoke about, and then I really would like to hear your thoughts as someone who is actually doing litigation on behalf of Indigenous people, as well as other people in the state of Arizona regarding water issues. But the first thing is the mining, where Arizona, we're still under the mining law. I believe it's in the 1800s, maybe the early 1900s, where the Arizona Department of Water Resource must issue permits to pump water to mining. So that needs to be changed, and that's something that is something has been fought through the legislature for a number of years. I've introduced legislation and nothing occurs. The second thing was when Jay was talking about Harquahala, is that my concern is back when they did the INAs, that there was in the 1990s. And so what occurred is very different population in those areas now. And so the pumping I think would be a concern. And then two more things. First, in the quality of water that's actually being pumped. And then Jay had mentioned the fact that it would go into the CAP. And I know it needs to be treated, but who's going to pay for that? So my concern is, in the long term, ratepayers are going to have to pay for the treatment of that water going into the canal. And then the third thing my concern is who is backing this, and you know, articles that were from the New York Times, etc., are saying that it's hedge funds. It's these people that want to build more homes in the state of Arizona. So that's my concern. And then regarding what's called the Water Infrastructure Funding Authority, which is WIFA, this is something that the governor had put $1 billion over the next 3 years. But what I'm very pleased with is 200 million is going to go to conservation, and how we define conservation is going to be very different. But I just want to leave that there. And everybody can ask me questions on their own time. This is Jay's time. And I just want to hear your comments, Jay, in regards to what you see in the future, especially with Indigenous people in regards to WIFA. Thank you.
So first, closing the loop on Harquahala, the senator is absolutely right. There is water quality is different in every source. In Harquahala, it's very high in arsenic, and that would need to be treated before. There have been some draft rules through the Bureau of Reclamation, which is technically the owner of the CAP system, regarding treatment of that. But the overall point by the senator is absolutely right. It's expensive. Treatment of water is expensive. Generally, treatment for arsenic is expensive. That would have to be treated before it's put into the CAP system. And so the cost of that water would be substantial, 100%. On WIFA, as the senator mentioned, that's the Water Infrastructure Finance Authority that exists right now. And every state has WIFA, and essentially it's a board that manages funding that comes from 2 federal acts, the Clean Water Act and the Clean Drinking Water Act, and it's supposed to create a revolving fund for water infrastructure. Essentially what the legislature did this year is they said, we're going to take WIFA as it exists, and we're going to create 3 new funds that board will manage, and create a new board as well. And then one of those, as the senator mentioned, is $1 billion for what they're calling water augmentation. Remember when I talked to you about the Republican approach, which was we'll just go find more water somewhere. That's that $1 billion. That's that $1 billion down payment on water from somewhere. We don't know where yet. We also don't know how it would be funded or how it would be financed, because that fund is set up to do bonding and through private-public partnerships. So that could turn into some other sort of private water market scenario. And so watching that, I think spending $1 billion for water infrastructure is a really good thing. But who comes down the line on that, I think, is an open question that we really have to watch. And so those will be open meetings, and I'll definitely be interested in those. There are 2 other funds. One is for loans and grants for rural water infrastructure. That's really important. And the third one, as the senator mentioned, is a $200 million fund for water conservation. Really put in there thanks to the leadership of Senator Gabaldon and her colleagues in the Senate and the House on the Democratic side. That's a real win. $200 million for actual water conservation in the state. There hasn't been an investment like that since I've been involved in water politics. And so I'm really looking forward to that. I think that's going to be really important. And that could be used for a number of different things. As for tribes, fortunately, because this water infrastructure funding really only passed with Democratic support, and thanks to their leadership, tribes are able to participate in all of those funds. Tribes have shown over the last 10 years in particular leadership on water management. And as we get less water, that the tribal water rights are going to be more important, and there's going to be real leadership there. So I think we're entering a time now where even folks who weren't at all happy about it are having to understand that having tribes at the table for these discussions is essential, and that's really essential. And so that means more involvement for tribes. That's really good. But we have so many question marks now that there's no simple answer, and it's the further you look out, it gets a little bit more depressing. But there's a lot of challenges in front of us, and certainly there will be more water policy legislation in the next year and the year after that. And, you know, keep sending back Senator Gabaldon so we have someone to talk about it with.
All right, we have a couple more questions. Helen, Matthew, do you have another question? Your hand's up.
It's me, it's Helen.
Okay, Helen.
I know that the idea of pipelines has been brushed aside more than once. But the thing is that any ideas about the future usually are brushed aside. Like I remember when Carter had the idea that that we have global warming, that was brushed aside then. And plenty of us here today wish we had listened to Carter back then and gotten to work then. I really, I hate to say this, but I think maybe even though it looks really expensive now, if we get to work on things, on something like this now, it won't be as expensive looking at doing it now, because it just sure seems like a good idea to me. And if it leaks, it really won't be that bad a deal. Just a thought.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an important thought. You know, the cost of infrastructure now, the investment in it now is going to be more than we're going to have to pay in the future for sure. I didn't mean to be dismissive of a pipeline. It may be necessary. And, you know, desalination is another thing we haven't talked about. But that's also very expensive, and that may be needed in the future. The concern I have mainly from the Republican perspective on this is that the solution that they propose is a pipeline and nothing else, right? And so, you know, it would take 30 years to build that pipeline. It would cost a lot of money. We have crises right now. And if we're unwilling to talk about conservation or effective water management in the state, only so we can talk about pipelines as they have done, that's the real concern. So I agree with you. And there have been studies, real studies by real professional people about what that pipeline might look like. The most cost-effective one is probably a pipeline from the Missouri River system to the Denver area. And then Denver would essentially wheel the water it takes from the Colorado River system back into that. That would be a really expensive project. It's a little less costly and impractical than some other proposals out there, but you know, those may very well be in our future. And we have, fortunately, thanks to some funding from the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, there is funding to do some big projects, which is good. But we really need to look short-term and long-term. If we look long-term to the exclusion of short-term, the system's going to crash.
Jay, we only have time for maybe a couple more questions, unfortunately. Pat Pickett, could you have a question for us? And
Yes, I do. I'm just hoping that we can recap the things that we can do, letters that we should write on a national level and on a state level to try to improve the water situation. Can somebody tell us what are the key things that we should be writing about and working for?
Well, it's been a while since I've worked in campaigns, though I have in the past. What I would suggest is following what's happening on the Colorado River and expressing your concern about what's going on in the Colorado River system to the Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland, and also to your congressional delegation. Kirsten Engel, like I said, is an expert on water. She needs to hear that her constituents are concerned about it as well. And she can take that and say, it's not just me, it's not just people in the water community. Everyone's really concerned about it.
That would be on the national level that we would, yeah. Now, state level, for example, you were saying that there needs to be legislation to keep the Arab people from growing alfalfa and taking it off to, to whom should we write, or what legislation should we ask for? Or
write the governor to ask for groundwater management. And there have been a lot of working groups There's a lot of discussion. It got close for what's called Rural Management Act. But send those. The legislature is going to change a lot next year, so keep an eye on who goes back, who's the Senate president, who's the Speaker of the House. But certainly send it to the governor, whoever the governor is, and say we need water management in rural areas.
So we should just wait until the new people take
Yeah,
office.
Doug Ducey's not going to do anything about it. Trust me.
True. Okay, very good. Thank you.
Also, right, the chairman of the Natural Resources in Congress, who is Raul Grijalva, Congressman Grijalva. I think that'd be good.
Pardon, what was the name of the?
His name is Raul Grijalva.
Okay. Oh, Raul. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Grijalva.
And he's been a great leader on water as well.
Yeah.
I mean,
Jay, while we've got you and the senator here, I understand there's a hearing on the AMM is having a hearing in either Wilcox or Bisbee on August the 30th. Do you know anything about that? Will that be an open meeting where people can speak, or is that just a factual information gathering? Do you, has any of you, either one of you heard about it?
yeah, I believe that will be a sort of public hearing for the Department of Water Resources. You may want to look at their website to get more information about it. Like I said, those AMA petitions being on the ballot it's the first time it's happened in the state. And so, the Department of Water Resources is going to have to figure out how to deal with that as well. It's sort of uncharted territory, but should be very interesting.
Yeah, that has a lot of effect in our new legislative in LD 19. So we want to make sure that if we can, we get a group of people out there to support changes, because that groundwater is a big problem for the people in that Wilcox Bisbee area. So yep.
George Sonda is trying to get a bunch of people to go with her.
Right, and we'll put out some more information. Thank you, Sonda, for doing that. And the other two things I want to say that Senator Gabaldon mentioned is, and you too, Jay, is we need to get the people elected that are going to pay attention to our water. Sandra
Yeah.
Clark, LD 19, we need to get her elected.
Yeah.
She is up against two tough Republicans, and we can do it, but we need to make sure that we get out the vote on election day. So that's the number one biggest step we can take right away. And the other one is get Kristen Ingalls from our Congressional District 6 elected. We need to get those two people that will take care of us in the Green Valley LD 19 CD6 area. That is so important right now.
And I'll note for you, one of those two Republicans in LD 19, Gail Griffin, is the largest impediment to sound water policy in the state legislature.
Yep.
Yeah, she's been chair of Natural Resources for a number of years, and some really good legislation on both sides of the aisle she has refused to hear in the House in that committee. And yes, it would be ideal if we were to get a champion of our environment elected.
Because the downside of that is we do not have a Democratic candidate running in LD 19 for Senate. And so keep that in mind for 2024. We need to reach out to people that are willing to run and then support them.
Okay, George, do we have time for one more question?
Let's take one more question. And then we need to wrap it up.
Yeah, Doug Stein. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to make the comment that if people are educated not to vote for a Republican candidate, even though 2 seats are available, every Democratic vote for one or other of those 2 Republican candidates increases their opportunity to win. So we need to get the word out. Vote for Sanda, only for Sanda. Thank you.
Well put, Doug. Thank you very much. Yeah, vote for only one. You have a choice of 2, but vote for only one.
Just 10 seconds. I want to thank Jay for his presentation. Excellent presentation. Water can be a bit complicated, but you have made it a bit more. We've learned a lot today in regards to your presentation, and so if anybody has any more questions, please don't hesitate to email me. Even though I'm not part of LD 19, I will still represent Southern Arizona. So please rest assured that I will continue to represent you, and I'll know the concerns you have in LD19. Thank you. Thank you, George.
Senator Gambledon, you will always be our senator. Jay, thank you so much. Yeah, you did simplify it. So we asked some good questions and it was easy for you to follow it up. So thank you for that great input. We really do appreciate it. And we'll follow up, Pat, with some of these things and put them up on our website so people can make some decisions. Thanks again, Jay. Great presentation. I know we've heard several comments in the chat regarding this. So if you missed part of this, or you want to share this with somebody else, tell them to go to our webpage. The video will be up there by Monday or Tuesday. And so, however, next time, ask a friend to come and be a part of it. In 2 weeks on Saturday, September the 10th at 3 p.m., we're going to be talking about education, how to stop the voucher expansion and also save our schools. So please invite a friend and hopefully our senator will come back and talk to us more about that. And remember, vote for only one representative in November and vote for all Democrats up and down the ballots. Let's get these important positions filled with qualified people from the Democratic Party. Paul, is there anything else you'd like to share?
No, just that what everybody else has said. Great job, Jay. Let's hope the nightmare scenario does not occur in places like Lake Mead and other places. So, yep, that's about all. And thank you so much.
Yeah, we could talk about water for several years. So thank you all for being here and we appreciate it.